Today is the day that all these parts are going to stop collecting dust and we are going to finally assemble this 13B. Notice I did not say build because all the hard work of doing an actual build and machine work and everything was already done. For those that haven't been following along, this was a 950 gamble on eBay that paid off really well. It was a stripped keg being sold as is for parts only because it came out of a car that got sent to the junkyard for burning to the ground. Upon teardown and inspection, it turned out to be a well-built motor with the usual suspects for a higher horsepower street build, that being a street port, light in a balanced low compression Series 4 rotors, and half-inch tension studs throughout. All the housings and plates were in really good condition, indicating that this was likely a very low mileage build before it got sent to the junkyard. And this made my life significantly easier because all I had to do was clean up the parts, measure all the clearances to make sure that everything would fit together correctly, and then go through and restack it, which we're going to do today. So before we get into the details, this is the entirety of the internals of a 2-rotor Mazda 13B motor. Being that this is my first rotary motor, it's just really impressive how simple these things are. There's really almost no parts to it, and it's kind of crazy that something this small can make this much horsepower. While we are able to reuse almost all the hard parts, we do need to go through and replace all of the soft seals, as well as the apex seals for good measure. The apex seals actually came out in really good condition, didn't show any sort of wear, but I had no idea where they were from, so in due diligence decided to go through and replace those as well. There are quite a few places that sell rotary parts these days, and I decided to reach out to the folks at Billet Rotary Store in Australia, and they graciously came on board to support this project by providing the soft seals as well as the apex seals and some various OEM Mazda hardware. One of the reasons I wanted to start a relationship with Billet Rotary Store was, for one, they had all of the parts that I wanted, whether they were the OEM Mazda parts or aftermarket seals such as the Power Seal soft seal kit as well as the Power Seals apex seals. As their name suggests, they also have a variety of options to upgrade from Mazda's factory cast iron plates to billet aluminum units, and if this project goes according to plan, which hopefully it does, at some point this will get all torn back down again and upgraded to billet plates for the weight savings and some additional performance benefits. First thing we had to do was mark each side and the direction of rotation. We need to check whether the springs are within specification because we're going to reuse those. After we validate each part is good, it's going to go into a tray that's going to indicate which position it's going to reside in on the rotor. Normally the most tedious part of preparing a rotor for assembly is grinding the side seals to length. Much like gapping a piston ring, you need to make sure that the clearance from the side seals to the corner seals is enough that thermal expansion will not cause them to bind up when the motor heats up. I was able to mix and match the side seals to get the clearances that I wanted, except for one that went in a little bit tight. A quick touch with a sanding roll on the die grinder brought us into spec. With the side seals and corner seals wrapped up, let's take a look at the apex seals and make sure they fit the grooves properly. The apex seals come as 2 separate pieces, so we're going to super glue them together to make assembly a little bit easier. Next, we change the seals in the oil control rings. The inner one goes in pretty easy. The outers are a little bit more difficult to get the seal into place, as well as the ring into the rotor. These are also quite sharp as well. We leveraged our friends over at Send Cut Send to make a couple tools for this build. This plate's going to align in the dowel pins and allow us to positively position our centric shaft to create a top dead center mark. With a custom pulley and crank trigger, this is going to allow us to properly set the ignition timing of our ECU Master EMU Pro 16. Next, we need to swap out the main bearings and the stationary gears. I only have convenient access to an arbor press, so we're going to freeze the bearings, heat up the stationary gear, and loosen up the press fit enough that it can go in without too much effort. All right, so let's walk through our table of parts before we go and start stacking this thing together. The first of which, and most important to getting this thing reassembled, are the soft seal kits and the hardware that was provided by Billet Rotary Store. The seal kit is from Power Seals, as well as the Apex seals. They're also the street version of their Power Seals. They also provided new OEM hardware for the stationary gears, as well as the retainer screws for the main bearings. This kit is very complete and came with everything that we needed, except for the fact that I forgot that the 1/2-inch tension studs could not use the factory sealing washers. So these are called bonded sealing washers. That might also be referred to as dowdy washers. So I had to come up with a larger size that would be better suited to the 1/2-inch studs. Speaking of studs, we have our 1/2-inch studs, 12-point nuts. I believe these were from Extreme Rotary, as they have a fairly distinctive end to them that's a little bit different than some of the other ones on the market. We have our low compression, light and balanced rotors. I believe these are 8.5 to 1 compression, whereas the stock FD rotors are 9 to 1 or a little bit higher. We have our stationary gears, and both of these have some bearings that were just pressed in. So these are ready to go. The original bearings have shown some wear at opposing ends front to rear, which would seem to indicate that the belt tension was a little bit too tight. And because we have our hybrid drive system having a boatload of belt tension on it, on the front, we have a ball bearing by E&J Auto Works down in Florida, and then we have a matching ball bearing in the rear. If you can see that moving back and forth there. So basically what they do in the back is machine the rear stationary gear to accept a radial ball bearing. That does push the seal out a little bit, so they include these seal retainer flanges. I did need to give these a little bit of a tune-up. You can see where there's a little bit of tool mark and shatter. It looks like they hadn't accounted for the bit of a taper at the bottom here, but that was a quick fix, so these are now modified and ready to go. Outside of that, we just have some dowel pins, our oil pump, our counterweights, some other drive gear for the oil pump. All of the oil metering system has been removed. And finally, we have a mix of fluids, sealants, and lubricants to put this thing all together. All right, so we've already got our oil control ring seals installed. We have a front rotor, we got a rear rotor, and we're just gonna pack these things. Just like the factory workshop manual says, we are going to use petroleum jelly to hold everything in place while we're handling the rotor. That way all of our seals don't fall out and end up on the floor while we seal this thing up. Next, we gotta pay attention to what numbers are where. It was a bit cold in the garage during assembly, so that kept the petroleum jelly nice and tacky. Because these are used seals, we need to pay attention to which sides are shiny so they go back in the same orientation that they came out. First rotor is done, then we move on to the second. All right, so I think these are good to go. Front rotor is facing gear side down because that is going to go gear side down on the front plate. Likewise, the rear rotor is facing gear side up. We're going to likely obsessively check to make sure this stuff hasn't rotated. The last thing I want to do is tear all this stuff back apart when I can't get the apex seals to go down. For now, we're just going to put a single bolt in just to keep everything in place. Next, I'm going to start aligning the coolant seals into their respective grooves. We're going to put our front rotor in facing down. Make sure we fully mesh on the stationary gear. We're also using Royal Purple assembly lube because it's going to do a better job of sticking to the bearing surfaces and ensuring that there is proper lubrication when this thing fires up for the first time. With there being a non-zero probability, this will have to get disassembled before it has any significant runtime. I'm using vegetable shortening instead of petroleum jelly in order to prevent the O-rings from swelling. That way, if it does need to come back apart, that the O-ring should be reusable. After a touch of RTV on the bottom legs of the housing, it's just about ready to drop on. Next up, our first go with the apex seals. And we're 3 for 3. All right, now this is the part that I'm not looking forward to. Make sure I can get my knee under this thing. One last check on our seals. Dowel pins. After a little struggle with the center plate, we're gonna add the coolant seals, drop our rotor on, and then go through the same process after we add the housing and then our apex seals. With a welcome stroke of good luck, all 6 apex seals went down with no issues. A couple more coolant seals, a little bit more lube, and then the end plate goes on. All right, so we saw before, we're gonna put these sealing washers on there. They are self-centering. We're gonna also give a little touch of assembly lube just to make sure that we do not gall up the rubber and that we get a nice consistent torque as we tighten these things down. All right, so we're ready to torque this thing down. I've got our torque wrench set to 20 foot-pounds. First, I'm gonna go through and tighten these about 10 foot-pounds with a calibrated wrist. Then we're gonna follow the torque sequence, torque them to 20 foot-pounds, and then go up to 30 foot-pounds for a final pass. So let's go make some lovely clicky noises. And just to avoid going back and forth to this piece of paper, we're going to go through and label all of these on the end plate. One thing to always remember when you're torquing something is that there's a breakaway torque. So if the torque wrench isn't moving when you go to start it, then you're definitely gonna wanna back it off like a quarter turn and make sure that you get a little bit of movement before you get your click. Always get a little nervous when they start turning a little bit more than the rest of them. So we do one more final pass at the 30. Obviously not gonna back them off here. Just make sure that they all click on the first try. Make sure we didn't miss any. Now that we got everything torqued, we're gonna mark all the nuts with a paint marker. And this is specifically made for torqued bolts, and it's resistant to vibration, heat, all that stuff that you'll find on an engine. But if the fastener decides to back out, it will crack and make an obvious indication that the fastener's moved. So next up, we got our rear stationary gear. As we went through before, We've got our ball bearing, which is going to prevent our E-shaft from moving around. We've already got some assembly lube on the bearing, although we're probably going to put a little bit more on before we send it. Did install the new O-ring here. Just as a belt and suspenders, you can put a very light touch of anaerobic flange sealant across this face here, and then we're going to be good to go to get this thing bolted down. Next up, we got a rear counterweight. Was machined on this diameter for the bearing, and that's going to sit right down in here. We're going to install our Woodruff key and then put the nut on this thing, and then hopefully flip this thing over without anything falling apart. Next up, we're going to get to use one of the tools that we had laser cut through Send Cut Send, and what this is going to do is lock our counterweight into place and allow us to torque the nut without everything moving around. Typically you use a flywheel locking tool. Obviously we don't have a flywheel on this thing, but this will get us what we need. So after we have this in a position with the counterweight locked in place, this nut uses a big torque number. I don't remember what it is. I don't have a torque wrench that goes that high. So we're gonna do the obvious thing and use my Milwaukee M18 Ugga Dugga wrench with a fresh battery, set it home until it stops moving, and we're gonna call it good from there. And we'll leave a couple threads loose so we can give it a running start. That ain't going nowhere. So we're gonna have to go through and obviously stack all the front parts to check the actual end play, but let's just make sure that this actually does move. Nothing seems to be bound up, so we're in reasonably good shape so far. So we're gonna put our front ball bearing support. Try to do this one-handed. Do have a spacer ring. So next up, we're gonna add the counterweight, stack up the drive sprocket for the oil pump, put the front hub on, torque that, and then we're going to check our end play for good before we tear it all back apart and then do the final install with the oil pump. So before we tear this down and go and do the final install of the oil pump, front cover, all that fun stuff, we want to see how much torque it takes to rotate this over. And I believe I read somewhere there's like a 20 foot-pound max. So basically what we're going to do is just keep creeping up, increasing the torque until we just start to spin without a click. It's about 13.5 foot-pounds. So let's just back off again, take another reading. Yep, 13.5. We're getting some nice strong whooshy noises, so we are looking pretty good so far. Haven't seen any glaring problems yet, so we're just going to keep forging ahead and see where we end up. We have another part from the folks at Billet Rotary Store. I believe this is another power seals part as well. So before we put our front cover on, we got to put a new front seal, and we did put a plug in the front cover to block off any of the oil flow for the oil metering pump. Because that is fully deleted, we are going to run premix. We'll do this right with a seal driver. Now we bolt the front cover on. All the fasteners are gold anodized titanium. That was a terrible noise. These were also titanium fasteners that have the Torx on the inside. I didn't want to partake in Volkswagen's triple square nonsense, so we omitted the factory bolts for these with some negligible weight savings as well. We're going to take some last measurements of the depth of the oil pickup tube to the bottom of the pan. It's about 4 millimeters of clearance, which is going to work out quite well. I'd covered the design, fabrication, and assembly of the stainless oil pan in a previous video, so check that out if you want to know more. Gonna bolt the oil filler tube into place, which I forgot to design an O-ring into, so we're gonna use some RTV to seal that one up as well. I did, however, remember the O-rings for the oil filter adapter housing, which uses a BMW N54 oil filter and cap. It's held in place with special sealing bolts that have an embedded O-ring. And then we add a lock nut on the bottom just for good measure. Because the first time you do something, you're probably gonna screw it up, so you wanna spend some time trying to do some error checking. And what we're gonna do here to make sure we didn't mess up our coolant seals is pressure test the cooling system. And we're gonna plug the water inlets and outlets. I'm going to put a Schrader valve on one of the open ports over here. Then finally, back on a rear plate, we have a modified 8AN ORB fitting for a pressure gauge. So what we're going to do is pressurize this thing with about 20 pounds of air, and hopefully it does not bleed down over a couple hours.
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
In my haste, I forgot that the coolant could possibly leak through the threads on the nuts on the studs, so I had to back them off one by one, add some sealant, and then retorque. Let's hope that this time it will hold 20 pounds of air for a couple hours without any bleed down. All right, so we're sitting about 9 hours later. This thing hasn't moved. If anything, it's actually increased with pressure. I filled this up about 6 o'clock this morning. It's about 30 degrees Fahrenheit when I woke up. It's a little over 50 now, so that would make some sense. I think we're good, so we're just gonna air this thing down. So one of the last pieces of the puzzle is the hub bolt for the eccentric shaft, and I had to trim the front of this down to clear the inverter. And because we didn't have too many threads left, you can see where the original stopped. I had to make a little holding fixture so that my buddy Chris could put this in a mill, take the flats down flush with the face here, and then that way we have enough engagements on the socket that we can actually torque this thing without the socket slipping off and busting my knuckles or rounding this off and having it permanently stuck. This is another one with a pretty high torque spec, something like 200, 210 foot-pounds, so we're gonna ugga-dugga this one home too. Socket gripped well enough. We didn't annihilate any of our freshly machined flats, so we are good to go here as well. We got the last of our parts from Billet Rotary Store. Power seals, intake manifold gasket. Slide this right on and call it done. Finally, we're going to bolt the intake manifold and the rest of the induction system into place with the hopes that this will not have to come apart anytime soon. With the motor assembled, it's time to mate it to the transmission and get this thing off the engine stand. So that's it for this phase. Thanks for following along. As an outsider kind of researching into the rotary community, one might come to the conclusion that all parts are bad and nobody knows how to build a motor. So I'd love to hear all you guys tell me what I did wrong and what I chose wrong in the comments. I'm sure that'll be entertaining. Again, if you made it this far, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Next video, we're going to take a look at some CAN bus reverse engineering and finish off the integration of the flappy paddle steering wheel that I did in the previous episode. Then after that, we're going to take a look at some other possible swaps for the i8 chassis. So check it out.